Hello, everybody. This is episode 528 of Constructive Criticism. I'm Heezy. I'm joined by Mason
Hello, hello.
and Abe.
No, you're not.
I'm not. Okay. Well, yeah, Abe's apparently still in DC. They just got back from the regional championship for Magic the Gathering, and that is what we are going to be discussing today. We got some data from Frank Karsten that came out, and I'm excited to talk about it. Before we dive into, individual stuff, and I just want to talk about like what happened at the RC. I'll kind of kick things off. I saw Doomwake playing Rakdos Cauldron and was like, "Oh, this is spicy." Like I was not expecting this deck this weekend. Just like I didn't. It wasn't even on my radar of things to like go back and try. But it makes a lot of sense for those who don't know that did take down the event, and it makes a lot of sense from like was it you, Mason, who was telling me like the Raptors just needed to do something other than like be a mid-range pile in order to compete.
Doesn't really sound like me, but I do think that like the black cards are really strong, and the like burst potential of that deck is very real, and was something I looked into a little bit, and probably didn't give it as much time as maybe it needed, but we'll get more into that later.
Yeah, beating another Rakdos deck in the final, so the red-black cards are not dead, Abe.
Yeah, I mean, like the format is in a really, really interesting place, and I don't know. I think the idea that Tree is like something out of nowhere is a bit odd. If you were paying attention to the Magic Online results in the weeks leading up, this deck had put up some numbers. I think it's just one of those things where unless you were really familiar with playing it, it was a bit daunting to pick up. It didn't really have a lot of surprise factor. A lot of the cards are the same as a lot of the Rakdos decks we've seen otherwise, and it kind of has it's plain Tree of Perdition, man. Like you're really gonna be like, yeah, I got my one shot at the RC for the season. Let me throw it all in on mythics from.
I don't know. I think that like what you're throwing it in on is Cauldron, right? You're not really throwing it in on Tree of Perdition.
Yeah, I mean you're throwing it in on Cauldron, but like sometimes you're gonna draw a tree and not a Cauldron, and I think that there's a very real amount of like, this deck does look good, and even myself, like I didn't dedicate a ton of time to it either because the deck does look good. I did kind of like its angle and positioning, but I wasn't really on board with playing a deck that felt like it would have draws of like, oh, I drew 2 Tree of Perditions, 3 lands, a Thoughtseize, and a Cauldron, and like this hand's looking like the truth. But I think it is a deck that clearly was very, very rewarded to and rewarding to the players who put time into it. So like the Rakdos cards and really just Thoughtseize in general, I think once again a huge winner of the tournament.
Yeah, I think the thing for me about the tree deck is Marvin was a pretty clear include in my mind. It was really the question was like, do you play one Marvin or 2 Marvins, right? Like that's kind of where a lot of debate went. And then the thing that I missed with this deck, which is silly because it was a card I was pretty high on, was FOMO. Like when first starting to test, like we saw it, I believe in the supers, those lists had FOMO, but like that's a card that I think really helps these kind of decks out a lot as well. And I think in just general, like having the disruptive cheap black cards combined with pressure is really good. We've seen that in now, various shells, and this one is like kind of taking a bit of a more resilient stance when it comes to that, thanks to Agatha's Soul Cauldron. And yeah, the deck is very impressive and just plays like a good, fair game. And I think I underappreciated that a little bit like I did Greasefang, which I'm sure we'll get more into later as well.
Yeah, the only other thing from like what happened before we get into like the data and stuff, just shout out to everybody who qualified for the Pro Tours. Like, it's always really cool when you go to like these when you like are not at the regional championship and like you're seeing these people that like you are invested in their results, and like it's like one of the better parts and underappreciated parts of Magic is when like your homies like get there. And I don't know, I just shout out to everybody who had like a solid weekend. And I know we had a local player at Embrace took 11th, unfortunately lost his winning in on camera, but like I don't know, it's just always really cool to see that type of stuff. But like the kind of the things that I want to talk about, I don't know if you guys have anything from like a data perspective, but like Selesnya Company would be like the first thing that I found to be kind of an outlier and what I not what I expected. But
Yeah, I had played against this deck some in leagues, and it's actually kind of a thing that I like. Those are the kind of the decks I do enjoy playing. I think there's some really powerful stuff going on there. Team Scrap Heap, or the like kind of this new up and coming team of mostly Zoomers who are the ones who played it at the RC, and there's some players in there who are playing Worlds this year, and some other ones that are just like very talented Magic players. And I think that that deck is quite good and was well positioned for the weekend, and had a big edge of what you're talking about, Spencer, where even like invested people probably weren't fully prepared for it, and it's very customizable. And I think the new enduring creature, whose name I'm forgetting now, but the lamb that draws a card when you basically play any creature in the deck, that really helped the deck to sort of not have this issue that was so classic with these decks, which was you draw one too many lands, you start drawing land or elves, you run out of gas. Now this deck, with those sort of hate berry cards being well positioned combined with that, was a real powerhouse. And I'm really excited to see decks like this evolve in the future. In general, I think Pioneer is in like a very good spot. We're seeing kind of, some downward pressure from some of the top decks, but other decks are actually able to rise up and survive that in a way that we didn't see as well with things like Amalia and Bane Ripper joining the likes of Izzet Phoenix at the top. So it's really exciting to see.
I think that one thing, just like the decks we talked about so far, which, it's a select few, but like they're following the same rules of engagement that we had talked about in our Pioneer episode a while ago, right? Like we have a Land War Elves deck, you have Thoughtseize decks. Like, it's not like the most powerful cards have changed. Like they're still the same cards, but it's about finding like the shell that like works for those things.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I talked about it on the patron only episode the week before, I guess 2 weeks before the RC. But there really is this power vacuum that existed in the texture metagame for a mid-range deck to emerge. Like the loss of vampires as the Apex Predator Thoughtseize mid-range deck really had not been replaced, and like it's very unsurprising to me that of the decks that I think were really the breakout decks of the weekend, it was the finals was 2 different Thoughtseize Fable decks which were trying to kind of take on some of that role. The winningest deck in terms of win rate, I should say, outside of the company deck, the third most winning deck, the Mono Black Demons deck, was also just a take on the let's play black mid-range cards archetype. And like, I think its positioning coming in was very good because it's naturally what preys on the one being the 2 most registered decks, Blue White Control and Rakdos Aggro, of just here's decks that are playing both ends of the spectrum, and here's something strong that can cut it down the middle. And over the course of the weekend, that really played out to be how the winners metagame developed. I think Selesnya Company's success really comes from being not only disruptive enough to both ends of the spectrum, but also enduring, in a sense, playing a role of making those black mid-range matchups that much better, because that card is so near unbeatable in terms of just the ability to have consistent card advantage for those green-white decks, that everyone who I knew who was playing Demons, which is a lot of players, felt like anytime they played against that deck and played against that card, they were trying to think of different ways to maneuver around it, staying around as an enchantment, and like trying out different cards and thinking of different solutions for it in the future.
It's so funny because like I looked at the deck list and saw Gideon Ally of Zendikar and was like, I don't know how black deck beats that. Like, I literally forgot this card was in this format, and out of a company deck, like this sounds like a nightmare for any black deck to like try to fight.
Oh yeah, Gideon still got it, baby. That card still trucks.
It's like if the 4 mana split 7/7 indestructible, unkillable.
Yeah, I mean, and especially when your deck has 4 enduring innocence in it, like now you're zeroing your Gideon, drawing a card or two, like getting your 2/2 that's already worth a card out of your opponent. Like, I don't know, it's the Wandering Emperor that doesn't require all this finagling and also just like attacks. Like, fiving your opponent is very good in a lot of spots, especially when you need to close quickly. And so, yeah, like the Selesnya Company deck was definitely a really sweet one to see have its weekend. And it'll be really interesting to see how the format moving forward, continues to revolve now that there's these different, kind of the cat's out of the bag for a lot of archetypes. And we also have like the 3-pillar structure we had before. We still have the fast, competitive aggro deck. The deck's trying to end the game by turn 3, one way or the other. You still got blue-white control in a pretty good position, and Enigmatic is like the kind of late game inevitability decks, and then kind of demons and Transmog and Cauldron in kind of this black mid-range space. And so it's really fleshed out the format in the span of just a couple of weeks, where coming out of Brazil it was like a 2.5, 2 and a lot of unknowns deck format. Now we have, I feel like, 5 or 6 decks that, if I were to have another RC again next weekend, I would have to like run them all through my paces to really figure out what is going to be in the best spot.
Were you guys surprised looking at the data versus like being in the room? Like, what was the feel of like the blue-white decks, for example, like kind of just at the tables?
I mean, for me, I had my friend Kyle Shane, who is a listener to the show. He played blue-white, and I don't know, I feel like coming into it, even in my testing group, there's a lot of feeling of like blue-white was very good against, very good against Enigmatic, strong against like Rakdos aggro, had a good plan and set of plans against Phoenix. But I think there was a lot of just Azorius getting exploited by being known to be in people's sights. And also like a lot of emerging play patterns that if you weren't really familiar with blue-white control, that you could wind up losing favorable matchups if your opponent had kind of, understood what it was about or had a plan that worked well. I know that Mason and I both came in with a plan to beat blue-white with Enigmatic, traditionally a bad matchup for Enigmatic, that I know for a fact through testing, if my opponent was not, acutely aware, and even if they were acutely aware, it would make the matchup pretty far in my favor post board to have a plan of like, I have 4 Thoughtseize, 2 Thought Distortion, and still the rest of my mid-range plan to kind of like have these extra haymakers that blow it up. And so I think it was just a bad spot for blue-white to be in. And the fact that it still put up a strong win rate, I think speaks to the fact that the deck's just good. The cards are still good, and the good blue-white players who really, understand how to maneuver all those matchups and a lot of the quote-unquote the field that was there on the weekend, like, they had a lot of success. And I had a lot of very, very strong players. I got a chance to talk to Pete Ingram after the Reese Q that I played on Friday about like his decision about what he was playing, and he was like, at a certain point, like, I just have the 60 card blue-white deck. I am really consistently doing my game plan, and a lot of decks have a hard time beating that if I'm making good plays. And I think that played out at a large scale, but also a lot of people came with the idea in mind, if I'm not beating blue-white, it's not going to be a good tournament for me, so I have to. And I think it's real testament to the strength of blue-white and how it's here to stay that it still had such a good weekend.
Yeah, I feel like the people who are actively preparing and playing blue-white and were tuning their deck as they went got like even more rewarded. And a lot of people who picked up blue-white like after seeing the super results and hadn't played some of these new matchups really had a harder time with it. Like, I played one blue-white opponent at the RC across the how many rounds I played? 12 rounds, 11 rounds before I dropped when I was accidentally still alive for the PT. Oops. But when I played them, they had not played the Enigmatic matchup. They had played blue-white in the past, but they had not played since like my deck had changed from being a fire stack. And, had some conversation with them, and I think they played well. And they were talking, and they're like, I feel like I got really lucky to actually beat what was going on with your deck. And, what I told them was like, game 1, I got really lucky for you to even be in a spot where, you almost lost. And I think if you play this matchup again after playing it now, you wouldn't even have been in that spot. And then game 2, I think I got unlucky and you got a little lucky, and like, that happens. And I think that like that was some amount of what happened with Azorius with like the Transmog matchup, the tree matchup, the Greasefang deck coming back in a way that I don't think some people really fully prepared for. Decks like Mono Black mid-range / demons, like there's a lot of different decks. And if you had just played, a bunch of Pioneer 6 months ago and started preparing a week and a half ago, you were going to be kind of sorely underprepared. So it's interesting. I don't know if I got much of a vibe from the room. I will say I know a lot of the Azorius players that I knew were very happy with it. A bunch of people I coached and like people I coached and people I know from Atlanta combined, a lot of them were playing blue white and had a lot of deep runs with like one losing a PT invite. A mutual friend made it to the Pro Tour playing this, although she already had an invite. So she passed one down, which was nice. But, like they were very happy with it, but they were also grinding constantly and iterating their deck every single day. So it really, was a deck that I think if you're doing that, you're going to be super happy about. I do want to talk a bit about Rakdos Transmog because I think that's an interesting one from data perspective wise. I believe it got second at the RC. And this was a deck that pretty early on in the testing I really liked and then actually moved towards creativity. And I want to talk a bit about why and why I think ultimately Transmog was better for the weekend. So very quickly identified Valgavoth was a card you should be putting into play over Atraxa. I do think that is like a thing that should change up as time goes on. But like right now and going into the weekend, I believe Valgavoth to be better, and I still do for right now. And the nice thing about Transmog is you get to play these strong black cards we talked about, right? Thoughtseize, Fatal Push. You get to play Fable. For some people, that's like the holy trinity of Pioneer. And you get this really strong late game. And that's really appealing and really powerful. What pushed me off it a little bit was I was trying to get creatures in play with Rakdos Valiant being sort of the best deck in Pioneer at the time. And I moved off it a bit because I was worried about playing this deck that needs to resolve a card like Transmog to typically win. You can win without it, but it's much harder. It's definitely not a trivial task. And I think what I missed was sort of like with Azorius rising up more and more, people were going to skew their decks less towards Rakdos Valiant. Well, they're going to still have cards that wasn't going to be as big a thing. And I think that's where like myself and some other people I know who were like high on Transmog, then got low on Transmog. I kind of ended up with like, we were not doing a good job of double checking the work. And I think that's a really great lesson for everyone going into your future RCs, whether it's this season or a future one, if you're going to the States, where it's like, or in testing, go back and double check when you have big shakeups like we did with kind of the week and a half before the RC, where Pioneer Control went from like top 3-ish decks to sort of like 1, maybe number 2, depending on your opinion. Definitely from a popularity wise as well. So I thought that was really interesting. I think that deck is very good. I'm very excited to see how that deck evolves in the coming weeks.
Yeah, this was a deck that I had just an inappropriate number of conversations about over the weekend because my best friend just can't stand the idea of polymorph being playable. Like he just is like, there's no way. And like every time it was on camera, we had to talk about it. And like, I have like a lot of thoughts about this deck because I don't know if people know this, but like I played an inappropriate amount of this deck. Like when it first hit the scene, because I just loved it so much and like it fits my playstyle a lot. But I think that like one of the cool things about the deck originally was like between Treasures and Giganta, like you could actually catch Sure Track, so like it actually happened quite a bit. But like I think that the reason that like I think that people just realize that a lot of people, I mean obviously the deck and second had Atraxa, but like a lot of people realized like the format had caught up to Atraxa in a lot of ways. And I like for that reason, when I was thinking about decks before deciding not to go, like this wasn't on my radar. But I'm actually really high on the card on Nixilis, the Adversary. I actually think that card looks really good in this format as like both a thing that like puts out these really annoying like little dudes, and then also just like is just like really hard in a lot of ways for Control to beat. So I think that this deck getting to play at main deck is actually really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a field full of just blue-white, and as we saw, field full of blue-white, like, having Ob Nixilis is already a huge boon. And then also, I mean, Enigmatic similarly has a problem with just, here are multiple non-creature permanents that you need to deal with. Like, pressuring Planeswalkers is not exactly the game that Enigmatic is very good at playing, because it's so many creatures that are, let me gain incremental value and let me, you know, set up and kind of slowly grind. And Ob Nixilis is the kind of card that says, okay, the more turns you take to set up to your end state, the more it's going to hurt you to do this. And I think that those two being, you know, two of the four, you know, most played decks in the field, like, really gave that good positioning. And it's, you know, a very serviceable card on game plan for kind of the cheese plan A of like, okay, I'll transmog on turn 4 and hopefully this is good enough. Like, it is a really good role player that also was just a very strong card for the weekend. And I agree, positioning on it was really good.
I have 2 decks that I want to talk about if you guys will indulge me. The first one is Angels. I am a known...
What is there to say? That's awful.
I thank you. Like, people like are using the data to like justify playing this, in my opinion, just atrocious deck. Like, and I don't get it, guys. Like, can someone explain it to me?
I mean, but you're just not going to believe what I say.
No, I'll listen.
We've had the conversation in the past, and you still don't. Like, the whole thing is just, it is good against certain archetypes, and if you think those archetypes are going to be prevalent, which I think they were 3 weeks ago, it was pretty good, and some people just locked in too early. Like, I think you're really good against Izzet Phoenix and Rakdos Valiant. Like, if you're going to play against those decks, if you believe those decks are like 40% of the field, I think Angels is like worth thinking about. I think the real problem is people think that's going to be like 80% of the field, and that's never how paper metagames work.
Yeah.
So I think Angels is a really bad choice. I think it has legitimate, like, oh, it is good in these kind of games. Like, I bet it's great against demons too, for example, like mid-rangey piles, specifically black ones.
It depends on how demons is built. But
sure, I totally believe that too, because I also think that one of the big problems in Angels is how rigid it is. It does not get to play flexible games. It does its thing. Is that thing good enough?
I think Angels and Greasefang both fall into the same category of decks that were very strong when Pioneer was an underdeveloped, underexplored card pool, and like it was a strong, like, linear thing to do, but both of them are just not in the same class as the things happening in the first tier of Pioneer right now. And like, as much as those decks are still, like, you could still play the decks and you could still win tournaments, I'm not going to say they're not even reasonable decks. I think that is a bit extreme. I think playing Angels is a reasonable choice in some metagames, and you can build it in a way that you're playing a good company deck that is at least linear and proactive and strong and hard to disrupt. A lot of similar cards. You can do the same thing with Greasefang. Your deck has a plan A, and with Overlord of the Battlemark now, an even stronger plan B and C. Like, you have avenues to win, but like, compared to the other things you could be doing, it's just not even close to the same level of consistency and power as other things be doing in that lane.
Do you feel that way about like Jun Sack too?
I think Jun Sack has an entirely different problem.
Mason said yes. Mason does feel that way with Jun Sack.
I would say I'm like, that is more like Sack than not like Sack in my mind.
I think Sack, though, like, has so much potential because of its raw power. I think the thing with Sack is that its power is, it's not a deck it's a deck that has too many playables. You know what I mean? Like, unlike Angels and Greasefang to an extent, where there's not, like, there's only so many playables, right? You have to play 4 copies of Greasefang and a bunch of vehicles and a bunch of Grizzly Salvages and like some Thoughtseizes. Maybe you're playing a Traverse package. Who knows? But you're really tight in terms of slots that you have. Your cards can only do so many things. But like, I think that Sack has, at least historically, had access to, okay, we have Mayhem Devil game plan, an aggressive game plan with, like, you know, playing just all the same red-black cards and Claim the Firstborn with our ovens and things like that to win a small game. Or now it's like, okay, we have Yigra and can combo with Scavenger's Talent, but you have to play 4 cats, you have to play 4 ovens, you want to play like if you're going to play combo, you kind of have to play 4 copies of Scavenger Talent, you have to play some copies of Yigra, so your deck gets really, really condensed. And I think there's enough power in what's going on there when you're not doing the most powerful thing that you could afford to minimize the amount of like some of the frills. But
it's funny because I feel like the opposite is true of like cat oven decks in general, is that like in some ways, like when you don't draw your synergy pieces, like you're just like kind of playing a bad version of everything else, and like you're lacking power, right? So it's interesting that you have, like, at its core, it has power, but like everything that you described about the other decks is also true of Oven.
Yes, but I think the thing about Cat Oven is that the Cat Oven synergy alone enables a lot of very powerful things. Like Cat plus Oven drives talent, it drives like Yigra, right? It drives Mayhem Devil. That is like a very strong 2-card combination core that is not, it's diminishing returns when you draw other pieces. So like I think that a problem the deck faces is that you want to play 4 cats and 4 ovens and 4 talents and 4 devils and all these things, but I think that because the deck does not rely on necessarily drawing anything outside of cat oven, or even could be with the tools it has now, like less reliant on cat oven and like dispute and everything, that you could find room and a way to maneuver it. I think it's just something that requires so much more work. And like the idea of playing a deck in Pioneer where you're playing a 3 of driven, like playing 3 ofs and 2 ofs a bunch and to have like a more robust game plan around your core engine is just not very appealing, and a lot of work to even get to a point where it's like towards the top again. But I do think that the power of Cat Oven specifically is really present as someone who won a lot of games this weekend by just like sitting around draining my opponent out.
I think I'm with Spencer. I will say I think, Cat Oven is really good against like 1 or 2 creatures trying to pressure you plus something else going on, right? Like we've seen that historically, just, having that free blocker and that drain comes up. And I do think one of the weird things about Junsack in general is that it plays like a few rate monsters, like, Thought Seize type cards that are just some of the best in the format, and has some of the best answer spells like Fatal Push. But then it does have to play these cards like Cat Oven, which if you only draw half of them do lead to these really weird and disparate games. Same with Scavenger's Talent. If you draw like Talent, Oven, Thought Seize, 3 Lance, Devil, that's like a really weird hand that can win games. But when I compare that to what the other decks in the format are doing, I think it's much lower. I do think this deck has plenty of room to explore, and I don't want to like write off. But one thing I will say is like on Wednesday, I was like really like, finalizing everything, and I came to the conclusion of like, I'm not even sure Junsack was a top deck I should have worried about. I had it in like the bottom of my top 5 decks to be thinking about. And on like Wednesday, I was like, I'm just not going to even care about it. And part of that was like I had a very good matchup with Enigmatic. Like my deck just naturally lines up very well against what they were doing. I played a couple matches against Matt Foreman, the Worlds competitor, who played that deck and qualified playing traditional rack stack for Worlds with that. And, he was telling me how even though the Enigmatic deck has changed enough that it doesn't get the free wins against Cat Oven anymore, the structure of the deck still lines up very well. And I agree with that, and especially after playing some of the games. I thought it was going to be a little worse for me because of some of the power outliers, like you're mentioning, Abe, with the flexibility, but in practice, it didn't feel that way. And I think to wrap this back around to where it all started with like inflexible decks and like Angels and kind of pooping on Angels, like I think we should, for what it's worth, Spencer. I do think it's like, I honestly believe it's a public service announcement to say don't play Angels. I want to make it clear to listeners too, and sort of apologize. I think I came off a bit hard on you because I do think there are reasons to play the deck, but they're not realistic reasons in the real world compared to something like Magic Online. Magic Online people will play that much of the deck.
Yeah, and for what's worth, I think that I do understand the reasons that you said about Angels too. Mm-hmm. Like if you told me like I got to play against like a bunch of black and green mid-range decks, and Angel like you were like, hey, like 90% of your matches will be against like black and green mid-range decks. Like I could believe that, like, if I had that information beforehand, Angels is a good choice. My thing about Angels has always been like, even if that's true, is it the best choice in those circumstances, right? And I think that's always been my problem.
I think that's a great way to put it. And for what it's worth, I think if you like are like, yes, I believe it to be true, I highly suggest you play Selesnya Company, being the elf deck, because like I do think that like you lose some of those free wins that Angels get, because Angels sometimes does just go like Bishop of Wings, Valkyrie, Valkyrie, and I'm like, all right, well, you're at 32 or whatever, and you're hitting me in the air for like 8, and I can't win. But like elf into like Enduring, or elf into like Anointed Peacekeeper, which is a card I know Abe was high on, Enigmatic, which Abe and I both played at the RC, and we'll get to in a second. Like having those kind of draws actually give you completely different free wins. And I think you're actually good in almost all the same matchups and better in some other ones. And your game plan is way more flexible. You can actually play like dynamic games. Where with Angels, you have so many just cards you have to play to make them work, like these glue cards, that you cannot play dynamic games the same way something like this can. And this deck is actually good against combo decks, where Angels is actively horrible against combo decks. So I do highly suggest, if you're someone with the RC with time, please at least try a league if you can afford to with the company deck instead of Angels. Even if you end up playing Angels, I promise it's worth your time for those 5 matches.
It's so funny. You were talking like Abe's entire demeanor, if you're like an audio listener, completely changed from like the beginning of your statements to like where he's like, you're like pumping him up, and he's like,
I think that goes to the big stuff, and we'll probably talk about a lot of the other things.
Yeah.
We had in the notes to kind of talk about Abe and I's sort of preparation for the event.
That's just for me. Like, I just want to hear it. I think that if I want to hear it, they want to hear it. So
I mean, I guess I'll start with where it happened from my point of view, and then Abe, I'll pass on to you, and then we'll kind of meet back up when we met up in real life, as it were. I mentioned earlier, I really was high on Enigmatic, specifically putting Valgavoth into play for a couple of weeks. I thought that was really good. And I actually had Phoenix as kind of like a last-second backup thing, the same with Azorius Control. I had 1 Artist Talent in my Phoenix deck. I did not figure out to put 3, which was very dumb, but, especially in hindsight now, but, whatever. And that's kind of where I was. And I told a bunch of people in coaching, especially with like weeks leading up to, like, hey, you should play some Enigmatic Incarnation leading into Duskhorn previews, because this is a enchantment-based set. It very easily could get some real upgrades, but you're going to need to know some about it. And that's kind of where our story starts to meet between Abe and I, where one of the listeners of the podcast, someone I coach, who goes by Star Epic, plays just this deck all the time, just kind of one trick set, and was talking about the deck and talking about sort of some of his changes and what he liked and didn't like about the new sets, and talked to me a bit about playing black cards, things like Nowhere to Run and Thought Distortion. And, I kind of talked to him a little bit and was like, yeah, like, what if we just made the deck more lean? I ended up playing like 3 Skyclave Apparitions, for example. It's just, I always want to get this as my target and try and play the deck in a different style. And that is sort of me up to the point where I start working with Abe. So, Abe, what was your preparation up until the point where we kind of met?
Yeah, so I had been looking over, previews, looking over where Pioneer was at. I was pretty personally interested in High Noon and the High Noon decks as a way to make sure to have like a hedge in the Phoenix matchup, as well as a way to slow down the Rakdos decks and kind of open up the room to play a deck that was trying to go a bit bigger than the format was already. And Enigmatic kind of lined up as, okay, this seems like, in theory, a way to play the, one of the best cards of policing the low end of the format in High Noon, as well as enough ways to trump what's going on if people are trying to kind of go over that and under blue-white control, like the other mid-range decks. I think this is positioned a bit higher than. And like you're saying, Duskmourn Enchantment set had a lot of tools for it, and that was really interesting to me. Like, as soon as the red-white Caretaker's Talent deck started like winning and being iterated on a bit, that really caught my eye, and I was like, okay, this is where I want to kind of put a lot of my focus. And it wasn't until I was playing a limited RCQ, and Tommy Ashton was there, and we were just talking after the top four had finished about, like, you know, where we were at and what we were thinking about for Pioneer. That, you know, it's kind of talking about, this is why I wouldn't play like what is he said, like, what is the Boros deck like? What is the draw that's drawing me to this deck, right? Like, what's my 2-3-4, my 1-2-3 that's like, okay, this is why I'm playing this deck. And then kind of talking out loud of like, okay, so what about playing Enigmatic? Just as like posing as a question, and was like, well, I guess that doesn't, you like, you know, turn 1 Triland, turn 2 High Noon, turn 3, you know, Fable or the Overlord, and then turn 4 Enigmatic. Like, now you have kind of a more robust set of really powerful proactive draws in your reactive deck. And kind of talking about that really drew me into Enigmatic and had me, you know, working on just a few different ideas with it and trying to find ways to make it all come together. And Nowhere to Run also felt like a card that was going to be in a good position in the format, and I really wanted to play that. I felt like there was opportunity for, you know, some transmog decks, you know, decks that were auras decks that were like trying to protect singular threats, and having just the ability on Nowhere to Run in addition to a pile of other removal, and Nowhere to Run being a strong enough removal spell against most of the decks I was worried about. It gave me enough hope. So I actually got together with some of my local play group that I had worked with for this event pretty early on, and was like, okay, I've proxied up, you know, here's an Enigmatic deck. The mana is needs a bit of work, but this is like just my eyeball, like, you know, estimate of like what my mana should look like. Let's play some games of just like the Rakdos matchup, because if the Rakdos aggro matchup doesn't feel winnable, then like this whole idea doesn't work, right? Why am I playing these High Noons? Why am I doing all this? And that was promising enough that I wound up really like going back to the drawing board and saying, okay, I think if I can get the mana to work, all of these spells are good together, and kind of then taking the time to, you know, do a bunch of Scryfall searches, search the creature base. Jarvis U connected me with Paul Green a little bit before we connected Mason, and was also talking about some number of black cards and, you know, kind of like switching around the removal base, and really opened my eyes to the possibilities of changing a lot more than I was already touching, in terms of like, maybe I give up on Chain of the Rocks and things like Portable Hole for just other removal and things like that. And so, well, I did make sure to protect a lot of the things about the deck that they wound up continuing to work on and play at the RC, which was kind of the non-red Enigmatic deck with a bunch of the blue and black and green overlords. Yeah, that kind of stuck with me, and I think that by the time when we connected, Mason, and you were telling me about how you were thinking about that already, it was kind of a natural place for me to say, okay, well, without really giving up this confidential information that was given by another team of individuals who wanted my input, you know, what are your thoughts on that? And, you know, I guess from there, what you 5-0'd when I told you not to, and Enigmatic got put on the map. And then I think really though, like, you know, as the week went on, I was pretty focused in on Enigmatic. I was pretty sure if the mana worked, the deck would be in a really good spot. You know, Mason, you actually came with some really great tech for the mirror matches. I thought Glissa was really fantastic for me in a lot of spots, just as like a good rate creature to go get, and specifically in the mirror, like putting people under the gun. And like overall, the way that the deck came together was really great. I know that, you know, until maybe like Monday before, we were both kind of still in our own camps, working on the mana and working on spells and different ideas, and then came together, you, me, and Niall to work over the mana one last time and talk through what we were thinking as far as last card choices and making it work.
What were your guys?
But as far as like my deck choice, that was you know, kind of how that came up for me.
What was the difference in your guys' lists?
The difference in our lists were that I played a mana base that had one fewer Zagoth Triome for a Bant Triome, and I cut the plains for a Swamp, as well as I played one fewer Nowhere to Run in the main deck to play one Get Lost in the main deck, and then I played an Angel of Serenity in my sideboard.
Okay.
my reasoning on all of that is that in the blue-white matchup, especially after testing it pretty extensively to test the thought distortion plan, I was pretty concerned about getting fielded off of double black from players who like were, especially in open deck lists, like they know what's up, they can see what the game plan is on paper, and if they just attack my black sources, I feel like I could lose a lot of my edge. And I really was liking Get Lost as a way to cover, especially with Demons being a deck that gained a lot of traction in my circles in the 11th hour, like in just like the very last week, because it was a strong Thoughtseize deck that was really attractive, and you know, after they continued to play it and iterated on it and kind of like, you know, sand down the edges, it was just seeming better and better. I wanted to make sure to recapture a little bit of that loss of playing Fatal Push instead of like Chain to the Rocks.
Sure.
To have better removal for that stuff. And I really wanted Angel Serenity because I felt like people who were still playing decks full of like Sunfalls and really attrition-y decks with like a bunch of Wraths, that could still be a problem of like, you do have some really powerful cards in Enigmatic, like Atraxa and like Titan of Industry, and, you know, Arliss has Fables, and, you know, these like 5-drops and 6-drops, but at a certain point you can get run out of really cards that matter. And to me, having a card that like was not only good at stabilizing a board of expensive mid-range threats in the black mid-range matchups, but also good at recurring a lot of value in kind of the slogs. Like if I play against a 5-color Nibelite player, for example, like not having Angel Serenity would be a pretty big downside, because they're so good at just trying to answer everything you do. So that was how I came to my conclusions there and the difference between our lists. But otherwise, you know, the list that Mason and Niall had come up with and the list that I was working on were like pretty much lockstep. And outside of talking over like, you know, a few Enigmatic targets I had liked and they had liked, and figuring out what lined up best, I think that, you know, it was pretty harmonious from there, because we've each been doing work in our own camps.
So like, I think the thing good to talk about with this deck that Abe kind of hints at that isn't super obvious at first glance is that it is like a big mid-range deck, and that is why decks like Nivtalite are a problem, because you look like a deck that's like them that goes infinitely long, right? And I had a lot of messages about like, do you like, I think Marina is her name, she's like a 5-color legend that like looks at the top 7 and puts all the enchantments in your hand, or like, do you like the Niv versions? And that isn't what I was trying to do. I was trying to be a mid-range deck that ran people over. And that is sort of the core premise. And that's actually how I got to Glissa, was like, I wanted something that was good against aggro and good in the mid-range mirrors. And that is what Glissa is. You know, First Strike Death Touch is insane against the Valiant decks. I just can't break through it. And then Glissa has insane synergies with your Impending Overlords, getting them on the board a little quicker, while also just being a way to draw cards. And then the fact that it blew up enchantments was just kind of like this makes this like the cherry on top. I actually have something for the mirror. And in general, I was really just happy playing like a pile of removal and interaction. And I think the thing that really like, the one part that kind of wasn't mentioned by Abe that was important for me was when I figured out Thoughtseize was good against Rakdos Valiant. That's what sold me on like the black build of Enigmatic, where it was like, okay, I actually have like 4 Get Lost, 4 Thoughtseize. Those are super important in the control matchup and the Valiant matchup. So while my sideboard looks really kind of like targeted in certain spots, I actually have like enough cards to swap up and really fix my deck in multiple spots. And basically all my Valiant opponents were like pretty shocked that I Thoughtseized them, and we're all also very impressed at how good it was. And I think it's just an important thing to kind of note, like, Thoughtseize is good against that deck. It is a combo deck. And if you're picking up like a Rise list, you should probably be boarding in like some of your Thoughtseizes, because you need to pick them apart. And you're a Triome deck with like a heavy amount of them. So having 1 mana plays to do is super important, especially with your double Triome hands. And so being able to go like turn 1 Triome, turn 2, do something, play another Triome, turn 3, really impact the board is super important and comes up in a ton of matchups.
Did you guys have any conversations about being a Yorion deck with Thoughtseize in your board, and like how that's a little interesting?
Listen, man, Thoughtseize is Thoughtseize. The interesting part is that we didn't main deck it, I guess. I mean, like, we're not a deck that's really trying to use, like, for example, Demons, the deck that I wound up audibling to for Sunday, after missing day 2 of the ERC, is, like, very much a discard spell deck. Like, you want to have one every game, you want to do it every game, because of and it's a small game deck too. Like, I think a lot of times Thoughtseize is played in small games, and that's where it's traditionally best and where you want to have it every time. Like, in the case of this Enigmatic deck, like, Thoughtseize is one of, like, 16 cards that are trying to make the game small, and it's not about Thoughtseize specifically being Thoughtseize in the way it is for decks that are trying to present very specific threats in small windows, like trying to get through your Unstoppable Slasher or resolve your Haymaker that you're trying to cast. It was really about just making sure we had efficient ways to trade cardboard for the right cardboard, because a lot of the decks in the format are kind of trying to do a mix of things with the right cards. And so in a deck that's already really good at stopping top decks, because it has a pile of removal that it kind of wants to hold on to because it's very premium, things like, Leyline Bindings, or to a lesser extent, like Fatal Pushes in certain matchups, or after Sideboarding Get Lost, being able to cover most of the format. Like, it's so much less about, I need to Thoughtseize you to, disrupt your opener, than it is just, I need to Thoughtseize you because it allows me to make 2 trades in a turn cycle to grind the game down so my Enigmatic can take over. And I think that, like, I don't know, I think the Yorion deck thing is pretty overstated at this point. I think that, like 80 cards, when your deck's built to be 80 cards, people understand the deck building principle enough of, like, you need to be kind of on a macro game plan more than anything. Like, I played a match in the re-CQ that I won on Friday where I played against Rona Combo, and, like, looking at the construction of my deck and what I saw after seeing my opponent's entire deck through game 2, when we shuffled up for game 3, I was like, oh, like, my Yorion deck full of just, like, value and having access to enough pieces of interaction when I sideboard a certain way, because I have to play that many to have the density. Like, now I'm actually just an all removal deck with, like, some value cards and disruptive elements and Yorion as my companion. And, like, in game 3, I just let them do what they wanted to do as long as it wasn't combo killing me. I, like, get lost in a track. I cast a Yorion, flickered nothing, and attacked them 5 times. Like, those kinds of games can just happen because you get to play that density. And I don't know. I just think that there's some decks where if you need to be Thoughtseizing on turn 1, it's one thing. But for this deck in particular, like, I never really felt a need to say, like, oh, I need to draw a Thoughtseize in order to have a chance in this game. It was a matter of, like, Thoughtseize was the best tool for a job.
Yeah, I think, and I want to hear a little bit about what you meant too, Spencer. But, like, one thing to add to that is, like, I think calling this deck Enigmatic Incarnation is a little misleading. It is sort of just, like, 4-color, like, mid-range pile that uses this card to go over the top in some games, and I sideboard them out or lower on all that stuff a fair amount. Where, like, sometimes I'm bringing in these Thoughtseizes, I'm cutting cards like some of my Enigmatics and things of those natures, and lowering my curve and actually increasing the Yorion thing that Abe's talking about, which is so much of what Yorion is like, it has something where it's supposed to. This doesn't always have that 10 out of 10 premium one that you would get from a 60-card deck, but has more things to answer, which theoretically, your deck can't survive that many parts. But I did want to pass the mic over to you.
I just meant, like, I think that if you asked me for, like, my initial impressions of, like, playing a Thoughtseize in my Yorion deck, and out of the sideboard specifically, I'd be like, okay, that's kind of a nombo, but, like, I think that one of the things that we preach on this podcast the most, other than always improving, is having a plan, right? And so, like, if you have a plan and you have a reason, that's often more important than, like, some heuristic, like, Thoughtseize out of the sideboard is, a little rough when you play Yorion. I was just mostly curious if, like, that was a conversation that was had, or, as Abe said, like, was it the best tool for the job?
Yeah, I think there is a world where you can play this kind of deck with Thoughtseize in the main, but the enigmatic cards and the sort of quote unquote free wins that come with those in game one is very appealing. That's kind of why I went that way. And I think the thought seizes would detract too much from the kind of the stuff going with that, because to me, nowhere to run, one of its big advantages is it works with my enigmatics and my Yorion, and that's kind of the spot where thought is competing with like cheap early interaction. And it's actually, I think, much harder to like make nowhere to run a viable sideboard card, because it sort of just has this free roll game one potential of having, most of the format has creatures, and worst comes to worst, I enigmatic it away, right? Where that is much harder to have post board. So it's one of the weird configuration parts of a deck, I think.
Okay. I think we talked about the prep for the event. We talked about your guys' deck choice. Do you guys, I don't know, do you guys have other format thoughts of where the format could go or stuff? I'm not quite sure where the format goes from here after it kind of got busted open rather than the door shut in a lot of ways, which is really interesting. But I'm kind of curious your guys' thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be some kind of kicking the tires on Tree and Green White Company from a lot of people, and Demons as well. Just, seeing okay, how good are these decks? How do they line up? And also, when the people kind of, put their eyes on them, how do they go? And I think it's important to mention, too, that, when you look at the Phoenix data, the difference between 3 artist talents and non-artist talents is very huge. Now, part of that is a lot of really skilled players played 3 artist talents, right? Who probably would have been a little higher than the average anyways. But we still need to do the work. It is okay, I think it's probably really good. How good is it actually? And I'm really excited to see sort of the format develop and change. And not to make it even more about Enigmatic, because we have talked about it a lot, we played one version of the deck that was very different than a lot of people's. And there was 6 different times you could have said that over the weekend. Abe and I's deck was very different than Paul and Green's deck, than it was to Dom Harvey's deck, than it was to Canister's deck. Those 4 decks were all very wild. And one thing that Dom sort of said to me when I was talking to him between rounds was he felt he was going off the deep end relatively. And if you look at his deck compared to the one that Jarvis you played or Abe and I played, it's very traditional and safe. So I think there's been a lot of innovation. And I think one of the cool things about this is if you're in your region, you're going to see a lot of newness in Pioneer, and the format can go a lot of different directions. And a lot of it's just kind of okay, what does 10,000 games show us about these decks? And can the format evolve to handle something like Demons, like Green White Company, and still answer these other previous really good decks before, And I'm excited to see that. I think this weekend, Japan has their RC, and I'm going to watch that. The person who does ELO Project always restreams out the English commentary, so I'm very excited. Shout out to them for all their work they do in the community. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at on things. I know that's kind of a very vague and general answer, but a lot of it is there's so many new things. It's really hard for me to tell you what's going to happen, because I don't think anyone really knows, is it Phoenix adapted and did really well? Rakdos Valiant still great. Azorius Control, can it adapt its deck to beat all these new problems that are presenting itself? It's an interesting puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, I had the opportunity to, I'm probably one of the only people to play a relevant post-RC deck lists Pioneer tournament in playing the 10K on Sunday, where I did, like I said, I played Demons in part because I was a real believer in what I had seen from the deck in the hands of a Spiel I tested with Matt Tumovich, who went 8-1 on day 1, losing the last round and unfortunately having a rough day 2, but also my good friend Joel Sadowski, who wound up winning. He came in 6-3 into day 2 and then won 5 in a row and drew into the Pro Tour playing the deck. At one point I was just watching him play against Lotus Field, and it was a moment where he was just sitting there tanking for just about 15 seconds on whether he should play his land before activating Castle Lochthwain. He just drew Swamp. It's should I activate Castle Lochthwain or should I play the land? Does it really matter? And just taking the time to think through that kind of decision, to be I have worked a little bit, maybe a bit even feeling after playing the RC, maybe I was working a little bit too hard to try to make these things work, and there were too many indeterminates with the Enigmatic deck for a field that has now shifted with so many cats out of the bag. that, like, I think that the new world of Pioneer, after all of this work has been done for the RC and it's all out, like I said at the top of the episode, like, it is a much more fleshed out format where there are more than two pillars, and I think there's not any power gaps or like any voids that have emerged of, like, there's not that much area to attack. I think that all of the pillars of the format and all of the, like, really strongest core archetypes represented, and like, for me at least, I know for sure Demons is the real deal, and there are definitely decks that can exploit it. I think Enigmatic is one of them, which is part of why I played it. But overall, the format is just in a really great place for anyone who's interested in continuing to play it and develop it, and for all of the other countries and regions that have RCs. I feel a bit envious that they have the information that came from our RC, but also I'm really grateful to have played the RC that we had. I mean, it's got to be one of the best Magic tournaments I've played in the last, like, 5 years of active Magic tournaments. I'll say, like, taking out the COVID years where there was nothing. Like, I mean, it was a really, really sick event to prepare for, and the size of it and everything. And I think, like, if anything, Artist Talent might be the thing that pushes the format too far. I could see a world where Artist Talent Phoenix is more than what the format can handle after watching some matches of it in that Sunday event. Paul Green actually went on to put down the Enigmatic deck that he'd worked really hard on and innovated with that non-red build to play that deck, and I believe split the finals of the 10K with another Phoenix player who was also playing Artist Talent. So it would be pretty surprising to me if that did not become the de facto deck to beat coming in, as Phoenix is just as strong as it's ever been.
I just want to say too, it makes me so excited for, like, the new, for at least the United States, our split RC system, where this was, let's say, a year from now, and this is how it all happened, where SC took over a year ago, we would have another RC to play in a month, Abe. We would be back like, okay, well, like, maybe we took these in that first 2 days off, but now it's like, all right, we got to hit the streets on, like, what actually happens. Is Demons actually great? Like, how does Artist Talent change things? Like, can I shieldred my opponent out, right? Like, what is going on? Like, like, what's going to happen in the game? And that makes me so much more excited for, Portland and Charlotte in just a couple months from now. And I just want to also say, like, playing, like, a 2,000 person Magic tournament, I know was shocking for a lot of my Magic Arena kids that I have in coaching. And a lot of them were like, 2,000 is a lot of people. And it was even not, it wasn't even 2,000, like 1,850, I think was the final number. But, it is really cool to play a tournament that big with that much on the line, those stakes again. And one of my biggest regrets from the weekend, actually, is that, I wish I had kept playing when I wasn't dead for the Pro Tour. I thought I was dead. And because I was dead, I was like, well, I've got a long drive ahead of me. I should just hit the road, say goodbye to everybody, and, like, hit it. And I just wish I could have got to play those rounds, even if I had lost. Like, even if, like, I lost the win in for the Pro Tour, getting to play on that level with all these, like, great and strong players from all over the country, all trying to break it. It was just so much fun. And, I think the Magic Cons the RCs are probably going to be more like 1,400 to 1,500 people going forward, which is still going to give a similar vibe. But I don't know, this felt like kind of maybe the last one we're going to see, like, everyone at one, because now there's going to be that divide. There's going to be, like, some people aren't going to go to Portland, they're just going to do Charlotte, or vice versa, and we won't all be in the same place trying to break it. So it was a really special tournament, and it was really awesome to get to do it. And it was really awesome to get to do it with my girlfriend, who also, I meant to shout during the Enigmatic session, there wasn't a moment, she did so much work on the mana base. Like, Abe's nodding his head for the listeners at home. Without the work she did, I do not know if the Enigmatic deck would have been nearly as good as it was for us personally, and doing what we were doing, which was much, much, much more ambitious than the average Enigmatic list when it came to, like, we were really a 5-color deck, where a lot of people were, like, a 3-color deck with a splash. I think that's really awesome. And so it was just a great experience. I really loved this weekend, before even talking about homie hang type stuff. So
I don't know. I said this on Twitter. I knew that it was going to be hard, having to watch my homies. One, I've never been to DC. I said this, but like, I really wanted to go to DC. It's one of the reasons that I qualified for this event, and just like having to defer was, I don't know. I felt like I missed a kind of a special tournament where like it was just like it's kind of like a lot of Magic players' dreams to play in this large of an event that's this open, and I just I don't know. Yeah, I was sad to, but we all got to be in Portland together now. Abe,
Mm-hmm. It's
Mace,
true.
It will literally be the first time all three of us are in the same place after years
since San Diego. Yeah,
I know.
there's the picture. He was there.
Yeah,
He was there.
I was on my little picture, if you know what I mean. So, like,
so tall and so sleepy.
I know your head was so large. It was.
Yeah.
You really let that wind get to you there, buddy.
Yeah. I think this was like a really cool. I mean, part of it too was like personally, I played Rakdos Valiant 3 times and then had no other repeat decks. I played, what would you say, 11 rounds. So I played against 9 different decks. I played 12 rounds. I played against a bunch of different decks.
Yeah.
And that was a really cool experience too. And I also am someone who has a much higher tolerance for like playing against the same deck more times than most people do. But it was just like really cool to be like, round 1, the mirror, round 2, control, round 3, transmog, round 4, black, white, pack rat. Like it was just there, everything under the sun going on. And that was like an awesome thing. I wanted to give some quick hits before we wrap things up because I know we're getting close to it. I think this is a great spot just for us all to give like our hot takes. We don't need to delve into it too deep unless you feel personally really conviction about it. Decks that I think if you're thinking about playing and you don't have much time to test, I'm going to tell you just get off it, are Mono Green Devotion, the Red White High Noon decks, and Angels. There are better options for all those decks. I will say Devotion doesn't have a great analog with another deck, but I think all those decks are kind of outclassed and they're just better versions of them and better things going on. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I think those decks we talked a lot about at the top of the show, Tree, Phoenix, Demons, I'm missing one of them, Green White Company, all very good, worth your time. Abe, you have any hot takes?
I think that like my biggest takeaway from Saturday, like Friday and Saturday, was that like I perhaps was overthinking, like with all the possibilities, I may have overthought where I needed to be in the format and like took myself too many steps away from, like I was too many steps ahead from what I was trying to do. And maybe that means that Enigmatic will be, and I can see a world where Enigmatic is honestly a few months from now, like the best deck in the format, in the same way that I think, decks like Domain and Standard have the chance to be the best deck in the format of like, if we adapt every week and know what we're playing against and have an in on what is important, we can tune and we can prevail. But for now, like, I think that there's a lot that has gone back to what I think Pioneer used to feel like in terms of what the biggest pillars were. The Demons deck for me was very impressive in the way that just making a game small was effective, and the fact that main deck Duress was very playable against just about every archetype, because everyone's trying to do something a little bit unfair, which means they have to play cards that are duressable, was really helpful. And yeah, I think there's just a lot of innovation to happen in the format still. And yeah, I like Phoenix and Treasure Cruise are still way too good. I think that it's gonna be very hard for me to believe that Treasure Cruise should still remain legal with the trajectory we're on. But outside of, there's still plenty of other decks you can play, and plenty of room to find headway in the format, and a lot of work to be done with a lot of the archetypes out there. And I think that kind of becomes the challenge. Whereas for us, being right on the heels of the set release and right in the really defining the format from the outset with this tournament, like the work for everyone playing RCs after us from this weekend will be to just tune what looks good and take the decks that had promise, and especially with things that have a lot more possibility and exploration, like Enigmatic, and finding those ways to construct it in a way that combats what should continue to do well.
I have some hot takes. Let us still a trap. Don't do it. It's a trap. It's a trap. I think that like the data says that it is better positioned than it is, and if you read that, it is a little bit of a trap just to add to Mason's decks. And then just like to hammer home, I think that Belgavoth out of Rakdos Transmog is actually quite good and might change the mirror, the way that the deck is able to compete once it resolves its threat, things like that. And just shout out to Adam Brace, who, like, once again, local player, took 11th. You guys are going to know his name one day, I promise. Yeah. Played Valgavoth and had great success.
Great success. Very nice.
Great success. That's going to do it for our main topic. I just want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Untapped.gg. We've said it before, but it's standard season, y'all. We're not really, but we're almost there. And y'all are going to need to be preparing for the standard moving forward. And in order to do that, you need Untapped.gg on Arena. Use the link in the show notes. We get a kickback. There's free versions. There's paid versions. But it will really help you both track your deck while you're playing, track your stats, and the things going on as you change your deck and the different versions of your decks as you're testing. It really is a fantastic tool. And then don't forget to head on to your next Magic event with your own Constructive Criticism t-shirt. Let people know what you're all about by heading onto the swag store. That can be found here on YouTube if you're watching there. Or just in the show notes, yeah. So check it out. But let's move on to the main point of the show. It is always improving. Always improving is something that we talk about every week. We want to be better today than we were yesterday. And it's a mindset that we hold dear and that we believe, you're not always going to achieve it, right? It's not always a thing that's possible, but the act of striving for it is really what helps out. And I did something that I've been talking about doing for a long time, guys, and I played a challenge. I played the standard challenge, woke up at 7 a.m. my time, Abe. Actually, I had to wake up before that. It started at 7 a.m. my time, which is inappropriate time to start slinging magic cards for what it's worth. And it was really interesting. I played the 775 with a sideboard plan as my teammate Quentin. We both went 0-3 drop, and both thought that our deck was extremely well positioned. Our sideboard plan was really good, and had a lot of learning moments as we get into the standard format. And one of the things that is an always improving moment is kind of leaving the event having the inkling that our deck was really, really good, and what we did to improve it was good, and then being like, I can't wait to see the results to see if this is aligned with what the format is about still. And just for context, we played the Leyline red deck, Splashing Green. We played an extra Snakeskin Veil, and then we cut the Active Treason effect out of the board for Witchstalker Frenzy, because I don't think that stealing a Trax is a real thing. You should just try to win the game before that. And we got unlucky. I think between us, we drew an average of, there were multiple games as we were streaming to each other where it was turn 7 and we had 7 lands in play and lands in hand. And in a 20 land deck, sometimes you just have the run bads, and being able to separate the result that we had from our thoughts on the format as a group and being able to have those discussions was really helpful. But I have a question for you two from this event. You ready? Quiz time! Abe and Mason. I had a Picnic Ruiner in play. I made it a 5/3. So I attacked into a bat with a Might of the Meek under it, and then I had more pump spells in hand. So my plan was to deal first strike damage, pick up the Might of the Meek, cast Might of the Meek, give it trample, and pump it again. What do you think happened?
You don't get to do that. That's not how the rules work.
Abe?
It had first strike already?
It had double strike, yes.
It had double strike.
Mm.
So the reason that it's an interesting question is because I did not deal trample damage. So we spent a long time looking up the interaction between double strike and trample, and like, does the creature for some reason need to be in play if you give it trample after?
I guess because the creature is blocked, but trample says excess damage. There's no excess of a non-existent amount of damage being assigned.
So that was the conclusion we came to. We looked at the rules like crazy. Turns out there was a bug on MTGO that actually skipped the change in priority, and we didn't notice. Between first and second strike, it didn't actually give me priority again like it should have, and I cast everything during second main without noticing.
That's awkward.
So I did get reimbursed for the challenge.
Those cool things.
But we spent an inappropriate amount of time trying to figure out what happened.
That's an awesome story. Always check what phase you're in.
Mason, what are you? What did you do to always improve this week?
Yeah, my always improving moment this week kind of comes from actually like the playing of the RC, and the big moment and like the takeaway was from like the open deck list portion. And I've played a couple different open deck list things now, and so I feel pretty comfortable in doing it. But the always improving moment is like really putting that into action very quickly and like doing the things that I think matter the most in open deck lists. So like identifying how their decks differ from the stock, assuming they are playing like a stock known deck. Sometimes you do encounter not that, and that's its own always improving moment. But identifying that's different, and then spending a lot of the time really thinking about like, okay, now that I've identified what's different, how does this change how we're going to play our games? And does this change my core game plan? You know, does the fact that you have, you know, turn inside out as a 4 of instead of Titan Strength, does that matter for what's going on with me, right? And doing things like that. And so that was my always improving moment of it. I felt like I did a much better job implementing that in a more efficient and timely way than I had in past RCs, where I felt like I was doing it, but not as efficiently. And it's good just to sort of see that improvement in that skills I've been working on. So
I just kind of like add to yours. This is a conversation that I had with in coaching before it's RC San Diego, or like what are the list of things that I should be doing with an open deck list. And I think that like it can be actually a little overwhelming for the first time. So I really hope that people really take heart in what Mason said here as you go, whatever your next open deck list tournament is, that you listen there, because like, you know, we talk about heuristics all the time and things in game, but there are also heuristics that you should probably try to develop a little bit out of game to try and help you maximize your opportunities and your, you know, the things that are going on. Abe?
Yeah, I have 2 always improving moments, if that's fine. I'm sure that's wonderful. Everyone loves improving here, so I don't even know why I asked like it wouldn't be. But I don't know, I feel like I learned a lot about myself, and really just like in reflecting on the lead up to and kind of like the preparation process and everything we underwent for the RC, and kind of like thinking about how it played out. That's definitely one thing I'll get to in a second, like how I feel about that. But the other thing was that I had this great conversation with Kyle, who I mentioned earlier, who was playing blue white. Like I said, he's a friend of mine. He's also a friend of of Jonathan Skennick, friend of the show, who is a known control master to those who know him. And so Kyle asked him for like, what is the, what's the secret to playing light control? What's the wisdom you can give me? And he showed me this text that Jonathan sent him back, and I wanted to share it with you guys because I think it's something that, I personally don't really and had never really thought about things in exactly these words, but have definitely thought about games in these terms before. He said it was the following 3-sentence paragraph, which is: step 1, keep your eye on the prize. Step 2, sentence 2, figure out what your opponent wants you to be doing and try your hardest to be able to not do that. And then 3, think about, on the decisions that matter, what does the game look like if both players have their whole deck in their hands, if both players have half their deck in their hands, and then if both players have a quarter of the deck in their hands? Like, what does the game really look like, and what is important under each of these scenarios? Like, top 15 cards, top 30 cards, top 60 cards, and use that to guide what's important. And I'd never thought about, like, thinking about inevitability in that way, of, like, it is really, like, okay, both players have access to their full deck and their resources. Does this card matter so much that I need to answer it or not? Or, we're in the early stage of the game, is my opponent likely to have another copy of this card, so it doesn't, like, I should just let it happen? This threat might be really easily replaced by one of their many other threats, or, is this something that is a scarce resource that is important right towards the middle of the game? And just thinking about how those different answers those questions and kind of estimating that, and it just really gave me an insight to a thought process of a player who I have the utmost respect for and admiration for, of, like, how he sees the game in a way that I'd never seen it before. And so I really wanted to share that, because I think that that's something that a lot of players, especially if you play Control, or really if you play any match of Magic where inevitability matters and you're playing towards a long game, you're trying to determine, who's the beatdown. It's just a good set of questions, I think, to add to your repertoire, because after talking it out and debriefing some of the matches of his that I watched, like, along those same frameworks, it was definitely something that was really useful to, like, talk about, not just the what's the big picture, but what's the really, really big picture, and what's the kind of big picture, and what's the, the just big picture.
Do they?
I don't know if you guys have thought about that. Jonathan, no.
It's just like very similar to, like, conversations that happen in. I mean, the deck thing is like this, like, what's happening now? How do you want this game to shape out? And, like, what are the capabilities of both players depending on what they do, right? And just kind of the way you described all three of those things just reminded me of, like, macro fighting game planning. Like,
yeah, it was a really macro perspective, and I think it's really applicable to Magic in terms of just thinking about inevitability and thinking about, those different, like, different stages of the game as well, and a way to quantify it. I don't know. It's something I'm still chewing on, and will definitely be chewing on a lot when I play more matches, with it now being something I've like introduced to my brain. But yeah, I really did want to share that, because I thought it was something that was really, really cool and a different way of thinking about that. And especially in playing Control, I think the first two things of, like, keep your eye on the prize sounds like cheesy motivational speak, but, like, knowing what the prize is and knowing what your game plan is and where it is you're trying to navigate the game to is what Control's about. And I think we talked about that pretty well on the archetype series by Control when we did it. I don't know if you have anything else you want to say on that, Spencer or Mason, before I go on to my own revelation by myself. But I think that this weekend, for the first time in a long time, I have had to come to face the reality of I am not very good at predicting metagames, and I often overthink things. What I mean by this is that, like, and I told many of my opponents when just talking about, oh, this is how much of this is in the room, and, this is why I chose this deck, was that if you had asked me what I thought the top 5 decks for the RC were, I honestly would not have put Enigmatic that high. And it was the 4th most played deck, and it had a great showing, and a lot of people loved it. A lot of people wound up picking it up. And I just didn't expect that. And the only reason that I wound up being as prepared as I was because I kept on asking people and talking to people about what they thought the format would be like, and they all kept on saying, I think Enigmatic will be a big presence, and I just had to believe them. I had to believe that I was wrong, which is pretty easy for me to do. I know it's not my deck choices, not where I would put my strongest, one of my strongest capabilities. I think I have a tendency to play the wrong deck for tournaments. When I play the right deck, and oftentimes when I have my best successes, it's where the right deck is obvious. And so that was kind of just a moment of reflection of wow, I really didn't do a great job of this. But then I also thought about the fact that, the entire team of people I was playing with in the 11th hour, 7 people who were qualified, all switched to demons off of the decks they had been playing, in part because the 2 people who had done the most work with it were really, really adamant about it and kept on saying demons in our Discord and also in our Discord calls whenever they were playing matches. Just which is why, if during an episode you heard me saying demons, it's because that's literally what we were doing for
demons.
In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm the reason that Mono Black Demons is an archetype on Melee, because I managed to at Freak MTG that, Brad Nelson, we gotta get this on here because you're denying the mid-range players the fun of just walking around saying demons to each other, which is half of what we did this weekend. My throat still hurts. But I knew that deck had potential to be good, and I said it on the episode before, the Patreon episode before the show, that there was this vacuum that needed to be filled by a black mid-range deck that was proactive and played discard and fatal push and everything, because the form was right for it. I, saw the potential in what the demons threats were playing, but I still didn't really believe in the deck, even though it logically lined up with what I thought could be right. And so I guess just needing to go back and evaluate what is it that drove me to Enigmatic, because in the defenses I gave of it and the reasons that I chose to play it, I thought that I still stand by my decision. I think it was a good choice. I liked its positioning. It was definitely not a bad choice. Demons wound up performing better than Enigmatic on the whole, and it was more consistent in terms of its mana base. It had less risk attached, but ultimately I was kind of worried with the idea of people being one step ahead of that. And maybe I just overestimate the field. Maybe it's that I, underestimate my own abilities at logicking these things out. But it was definitely a moment of I need to improve at this if I want to succeed at this level, and also find a better way to check myself on, am I making the right decision for myself? Because playing the demons deck would have fit much easier to the day and weekend of Magic ahead of me, just because the amount of complicated scenarios I found myself in playing Enigmatic, which were challenging and rewarding, was high, and the amount of times that I think I only lost one game because I didn't navigate them perfectly, but that's one more game than I feel like I would have with demons, and I missed out on playing a deck that was the 3rd best performing deck in the tournament. So those are my always improved moments for the weekend. It was really, really big weekend for me in terms of kind of paying off a lot of the work that I'd been doing for a couple weeks. And so it's been a lot to think about. Probably will be a lot to think about for the next couple weeks too.
I was going to say, I think one thing to maybe even think about more is maybe some of the second order effects of you didn't quite believe in Enigmatic, but you believed other people believed in Enigmatic, and that is a bad demons matchup, and that maybe scared you more than it should have. If that makes sense? I do feel I have not played the demons matchup yet. I feel very comfortable playing that matchup. No worries, really. Didn't put any work into it.
Oh, and I feel the same. I want to be clear. I feel good about the Enigmatic versus demons matchup.
I'm saying maybe that's where the mistake happened, is some credence to what you're saying about being a little bit ahead, is you were well, I don't think much people are going to play Enigmatic, but everyone else I'm talking to is saying it's a top 5 deck in some amount, right? So do I really want to play demons if that ends up happening? And I think one of the things that is weird about the Enigmatic data is half the room played what I would say is pretty meh Enigmatic, this version Canister was playing, and then the other half was like really far ahead with like more interaction and like cleaning the deck up a bunch and doing a lot of very unique and wild things. And I think if you're into that second half, you're going to be in huge trouble. But the first half is like not that big a deal, I think. I do think it's probably good to think back about like what's going on in the process, and also kind of like stepping back and think like, okay, I know these things, but what is the average person knowing? Because I do think that is like where a lot of people mess up, is they think too much about like what they hear content creators or pros or streamers say, and forget that the average person doesn't always come to those same conclusions, or just won't come to those conclusions. So
yeah, sometimes they play angels.
Could never be me. Demons only, baby.
The perfect constructed clash: angels versus G-Men.
a tough one.
That is going to do it for Always Improving. I want to talk about some demons, though, and I'm talking about them Discord demons. They be demons in the Discord, and that is patron shoutouts for Paul. Shout out to Paul. And Big Dax Dexagos. Okay, so during our podcast meeting, we have this thing that we do where we talk about things that we think could be better, things that we could do better, things that we could improve on. And this week, when checking the Patreon, it is not clear to patrons where they get their Discord invite. And this has come up a lot of times. I should probably mention on the show every single week. Your Discord invite is in your welcome message, or when you join the Patreon. And we had some people leave the Patreon that I want to personally apologize to, that I did not see your message because my notifications are set up weird, and I have since fixed that. And I am sorry that I did not answer you quickly. So for those of you that are listening that joined the Patreon so that you could join the Discord and didn't get that, I will personally, because it's my fault, offer you to pay for your Patreon next month. You know who you are. You messaged us, and I'm really sorry. So that'll be better moving forward. Speaking of, things that are really great, though, is if you are a patron of $5 more, you have access to that Discord. You get access to the Patreon question, which this week comes from Mikey. Shout out to Mikey, blue-white aficionado, played blue-white at the RC. He says, rank the Pokemon regions Gen 1 through 3 for us boomers. I will go first.
It's 3, 1, 2. See y'all next week.
That is the correct order. I think that is the hot take for what.
Hey, you can find me on Twitter at Mason D. Clark. I'm out.
Mason's going potty. I also think Mason's just correct. And I think that Heart Gold and Soul Silver have convinced people that this is not true. But if you are literally ranked, but that's not part of Gen 2, that's part of a different generation. That's Gen 4. That's Gen 4. Heart Gold and Soul Silver are Gen 4.
Yeah, it's the Gen 4 engine. I gotta say, I mean, Gold and Silver are the best games because they're the best program games by a lot, and they have the most content, and because they also have Region
because they
1.
have all of the first game.
Yes.
Here's the thing, man. Here's the thing. I have like a lot of thoughts about this. The problem with what you just said is my problem with Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which is that the leveling is so freaking flat. It's so flat. Every Pokemon's level 34, and it is like ridiculous.
Yeah, but like I was like 9. Like, I never knew. I was just catching.
I'm not counting Soul Silver and Heart Gold or
that's
whatever.
They're not
any game you
two.
want to, that's fine.
It's not. It's not fine. They're not Gen 2.
They're just upgraded graphically, Like
that's not true.
No, they're
that's
also
not true.
The actual rules engine is different.
It's
who actually knows the Pokemon
different
rules,
game.
though? That's for nerds.
Oh my gosh.
So true. In terms of Pokemon quality, I gotta say,
Gen 1's
I don't know, man. Actually, you know what? I'm just gonna say it. I like Johto the most because it had the best theme song at the TV shows. Can I say that?
That's not
fair.
even true either.
No, that's fair.
Everybody wants to be a master. Everybody wants to be a star. Everybody wants to be a
lyrics.
Everybody wants
I'm with Mason. I think Gen 3 Gen 3's only problem is that you need 11 watery gems to navigate the map. But other than that, it's like you have contests, you have the Game Boy Advance instead of the Game Boy. It's the best generation by so much. And that's as somebody that didn't own Emerald as a child. I was just out here in the streets.
Yeah, I never had
playing
Emerald
Yellow.
either.
I was playing Yellow on a Game Boy Color. The copy of Yellow I got from GameStop for $10. So it already had someone's other Pokemon, and so I just
You just
traded them all. I borrowed a link cable from someone at school and traded them all to another Pokemon and traded them all back. So I started with a level 97 Pikachu. Shoutouts to whoever sold that copy of Pokemon Yellow with their Pokemon on it to GameStop back in the year of our Lord, 2004.
So, just some behind the scenes for this Patreon question. Which, by the way, you didn't actually rank them. Mason and I gave 3-1-2. You are?
I'm 2-1-3 because of the theme song, man.
My rankings are based not on the games.
Oh,
Because it ranked the Pokemon regions, not the games.
oh.
I'm basing it. You see, you're putting your bias on it. I am out here.
I am purely objective.
I am.
Yes,
I am what's going on there, and that's why part of why 2 is at the bottom is because their broke butt region needed to put Gen 1 in order because it wasn't cool enough. And Gen 2's got it all going.
That's not what happened at all.
That's what's going on.
A miraculous feat of programming occurred that they merged the two.
Sorry, you're breaking up, Abe. I don't want you to talk too much more because I'm bad on the podcast quality. But I think that's.
No, hold on. I have to tell a story. I got a story.
I want to tell a story real quick that I didn't know how to save for Gen 1.
What?
I didn't know how to save a game. I was 5 or 6. So I played Pokemon 1 like a roguelike.
You just rolled up and whooped Gary, and then whooped Gary, and then got the Boulder badge, and then went to bed.
No, I think the furthest I ever got was past Gym 4. But it did take all day.
You just could only play as long as your batteries lasted?
Well, not until I had to go do something.
You wouldn't just set it down on?
No, I was anxious. What if it broke?
You just turn it off?
Oh, yeah.
Runs over, that's as good as we can get.
I have multiple stories now. Okay. So, the first story is Pokemon comes out in the US. The summer happens. My best friend and I learn the clone mechanic. He has red, I have blue. Mason's like, you could clone? Yeah, you pull out the link cable on the fat side and you clone the fat side Pokemon that the other person is, during trading. So, you trade an Electabuzz, you pull up the fat side of the link cable, and both of you end up with an Electabuzz, which is an exclusive. So you don't actually have to trade back and forth. Also, we figured out the Mysterio mechanic, which lets you get your 13th item or 11th item, something like that, in your bag.
Missing now?
Infinite, yeah, missing now. Yep. When you go on the side of Cinnabar Island. So we show up to school as the only people that figured this stuff out in our grade with all level 100 Pokemon, all 150. And we were the coolest kids in school for a freaking hot minute. Second, Mason. I played this game so much that my Pokemon Blue battery died. So, for those who don't know, Pokemon Red, Blue, all of the Game Boy Color and Game Boy games have clock batteries in them to manage the save file on the clock, the save time. If it dies, you lose your save file.
Mine would never die with unused. Mine's probably still good.
So, I was one of the first people to experience this and got sent a new copy with a new battery, but I didn't have all 150 Pokemon at level 100 anymore and was heartbroken.
Did you still have your friend with the link cable so you could dupe all their Pokemon?
Yeah, luckily we just,
We just spent an afternoon on the playground just mashing that A button.
That's going to do it for the Patreon question. Thank you so much, Mikey. Like we said, you can ask anything, within reason. Within reason. You can join the conversation in the Patreon Discord, the public Discord, the YouTube comments. I want to give a shout out to the YouTube comments. I am feeling better. I don't know what was happening last Tuesday, thought I was going to die. Turns out I didn't. I'm back. I'm ready to attack. And then you can join the conversation on Twitter by following us there at CCMTG. Like, subscribe, review, and comment. It's the best way to support the show. Any of those that you do really, really does help. But if people want to find you, Abe, where can they do it?
Find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. Now that the RC has come and gone, I do have more availability for coaching between now and next month. So if you're interested, please just reach out in a DM or send me an email over at morenothings@gmail.com and include coaching in the description of that email, or just let me know in a message. How about you, Mason?
You can find me on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. You can find me at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. You can reach out to me for coaching on Twitter or my email, masonclark@gmail.com. I have some availabilities right now with a little bit of the low season when it comes to North American Magic. So if you want to get in there and get ready for your upcoming RCs, feel free to do that there. And Spencer, where can people find you?
You can find me on my favorite social media app, Threads, at Spencer15H. You can find me on Twitter at EasyGame. You can find me every week on the Need to Nerd podcast. This week, we just do like a normal Need to Nerd where we talk about all things. Oh, that's actually not true. Holy crap. This week, we did a special episode on the differences and our love for the Hunchback movie versus musical, because we're both theater nerds. Super fun episode. Should come out after this one, so stay tuned for that. Next week, we're doing a episode on our Need to Nerd about rom-coms. I'm a huge rom-com guy. I'm really excited to talk about rom-coms, so check that out. And then, you can just find me here on the YouTube channel where some stuff is in the pipeline. So that is going to do it this week. We'll see y'all next week with a brand new episode of Constructed Criticism.